She was 19 years old and homeless. No family she could call, no savings account, no plan that extended further than the next 24 hours. Just a canvas backpack with a broken zipper on the left side, a duffel bag held together with a bungee cord she'd found in her father's garage, and a coffee can, an old Folgers can, the kind with the red plastic lid that snaps on with a satisfying click with $10 left inside it. $10. That was all that remained between Clara May Holt and the open air. And with that $10, she bought a houseboat. Not a nice houseboat. Not a houseboat anyone would have chosen if they'd had a choice, if they'd had options lined up in a row and could afford to compare them. A rusted listing 30-foot steel-hulled wreck tied to a forgotten dock on a backwater inlet outside Brunswick, Georgia, where the marsh grass grew tall enough to swallow a man standing upright and the dark water held everything the land didn't want and never gave it back. The hull was orange-brown with rust from the waterline up. The wooden cabin on top had once been painted a pale blue. You could still see it in the corners, where the weather hadn't quite reached in the sheltered angles where the elements had been a few degrees less determined, but most of it had faded and peeled down to bare gray wood. Soft and fibrous wood that had given up trying to be anything but what the years had made it. Two small windows faced the dock, the glass fogged with age and salt, and the slow deposit of a decade of neglect. The door hung crooked on its hinges. A life ring dangled from the stern rail on a rope so rotted it wouldn't have held a child. The ring itself faded from orange to a pale washed-out pink. The man who ran the repair shop at the end of the dock said she'd be lucky if it floated through the summer. But what nobody knew, what no one standing on that dock on that warm Georgia morning could have known, what Clara herself could not have known, was that below the deck of that old houseboat, sealed inside a compartment that hadn't been open in years, was something that would change her life in ways she couldn't yet imagine. And not just her life. Her story, her understanding of who she was, where she had come from, and why. For as long as she could remember, she had been drawing pictures of boats. Hold that image for a moment, because we need to go there first, to the morning. Clara opened that compartment before we can tell you anything else. Before the backstory, before the journey, before the people, in the places, in the long thread of events that led a 19-year-old girl with $10 and a broken zippered backpack to a rusted houseboat on a Georgia inlet. She is kneeling on the rough wooden floor of the boat's lower deck. The space is cramped around her, the ceiling low. The walls close the air, carrying the mineral smell of old metal and standing water, and years of being sealed away from light. There is a flashlight in her left hand. Her right hand is resting on the lid of a wooden footlocker, old and heavy. Its brass corner fittings tarnished to a deep brown, its leather straps dry but still intact, still doing the work they were made to do. A padlock rusted solid has just been cut through with a hacksaw. The padlock is sitting on the floor beside her knees, still warm from the friction of the blade, making a small dark oval of contact with the old wood. Clara is not moving. She is not moving because in the 30 seconds since the lock fell, she has not been able to make herself open the lid. Something about the weight of what might be inside, something about the 40 years of undisturbed silence. She is about to break the sense that whatever is in this box has been waiting in the dark for a very long time, and that waiting is a kind of patience she owes some respect to before she ends it. The man kneeling on the deck above her, Ray Decker, who owns the repair shop and who has the kind of deep stillness that only comes from decades of working with his hands on things that require patience rather than force, says nothing. He does not prompt her, does not lean down through the hatch to see what she is doing. He just waits. That is the moment we are moving toward. To understand how Clara got there, to understand what she found and what it meant and why it meant what it did, we need to go back to the beginning. To a small town in the flat, dry, landlocked center of Mississippi, where the nearest body of water was a muddy stock pond behind the Holt property, and where a girl named Clara May Holt had been drawing pictures of boats since before she was old enough to hold a crayon without pressing too hard and breaking the tip. If this is the kind of story that means something to you, stay with us. Tell us in the comments where you're watching from. We love to know how far these stories travel. Let's go back to the beginning. The town was called Grayfield, Mississippi. Population 2,800 on the last census, though the number felt generous to anyone who tried to walk from one end of Main Street to the other. One stoplight blinking yellow after 10 at night. A grain elevator at the edge of town that hadn't operated since the late 90s, its corrugated sides sun-bleached to the color of old bone. Two churches, First Baptist and the Methodist one on Clement Street, that had been trying to repair its bell tower since 2004, and a diner called Mabel's that served the same breakfast menu every single morning and had since 1971, when Mabel herself had opened the doors and decided that the world did not need another restaurant trying to be something it wasn't. It was the kind of town that people from the outside called nowhere, and people from the inside called home. And both of them meant it differently, and both of them were partly right. Clara Holt was born there in the spring of 2001. She came into the world in the county hospital 12 miles away. But it was Grayfield she was brought home to, and Grayfield that shaped her in the ways that places shape people when they are young enough to absorb rather than resist. Her father, Eldon Holt, worked maintenance at the county high school boiler systems in winter plumbing. Year-round the gymnasium floor that buckled every January when the heating came on and expanded the wood beyond what the room could contain. He was a quiet man, not the brooding, difficult kind of quiet that makes the people around it uneasy, but the considered kind, the quiet of a man who has thought carefully about what he wants to say before he says it, and has often concluded that the most honest thing he can offer is simply to be present without making a fuss about it. He was good with his hands. He understood how systems worked and how they failed, and what you had to do to bring them back. He showed up on time, and he did the work that needed doing, and he did not complain about it. And in a school district that had been running on deferred maintenance and underfunded budgets for 2 decades, those qualities made him indispensable. Her mother, Margaret, was different in almost every way that mattered. Margaret Holt was the kind of woman who filled a room just by entering it, not through loudness, not through performance or demand for attention, but through a quality of presence that people felt without being able to name. She paid attention to things in a way that most people don't. To the specific angle at which the afternoon light came through the kitchen window in October, different from how it came in September, different again from November. To the sound her daughter made when she was deep in concentration, a low, barely audible hum that Clara almost certainly didn't know she produced a sound like a small engine running at a comfortable idle. To the drawings, because Clara drew boats. She had been drawing them for as long as anyone could remember, which was to say, since before she had the motor control to produce anything recognizable, since the crayon marks had been more intention than execution, and the boats had existed more in Clara's mind than on the paper, but had been boats nonetheless. By the time she was 4, the drawings were recognizable. By the time she was 6, they were detailed. By the time she was 8, they were the kind of drawings that made adults stop and look twice. Not because they were artistically sophisticated, but because they were specific. Because whoever was drawing these boats had a clear and consistent idea of what a boat was supposed to look like. How the hull should curve, how the bow should angle into the water, how the lines should run from bow to stern, and was drawing that idea with the focused, unself-conscious accuracy of someone recording something real. Crayon boats on the backs of grocery bags, pencil boats in the margins of school papers along the white space at the top of spelling tests and math worksheets, ballpoint boats on the backs of dentist office flyers and church bulletins, marker boats on old cardboard from cereal boxes. She carried a clipboard with her the way other children carried toys, and the clipboard accumulated drawings. The way a boat accumulates barnacles gradually, steadily, without the accumulation ever seeming to be the point. Margaret saved every one of them. She kept them in a manila folder in the kitchen drawer, the same drawer that held the takeout menus and the scissors and the spare batteries for the smoke detector and the extra key to the shed. The folder grew thick with years. By the time Clara was 5, it was nearly half an inch deep, the manila cover starting to soften at the edges from frequent opening and closing. By the time she was 7, the folder had been replaced by a rubber-banded stack, and by the time she was 9, the stack had been moved into a flat cardboard box that sat on the kitchen counter because the drawer couldn't hold it anymore. Margaret never threw a single drawing away. She never explained why to Clara. She never made a production of the keeping, didn't frame the drawings, didn't hang them on walls, didn't bring them out to show visitors, or mark them with the date, or organize them in any way that would have given the collection the quality of a deliberate archive. She just kept them with the quiet seriousness of someone who recognizes something worth preserving and trusts the recognition without needing to justify it to anyone, including herself. Years later, Clara would understand what her mother had seen in those drawings. She would understand it standing on the deck of a rusted houseboat in Georgia with $10 left in a coffee can and an entire life left to build. But she wasn't there yet. Margaret Holt died in the spring of 2012. Clara was 11 years old. A brain aneurysm. The specific devastating arbitrariness of it, the way it arrived with no warning, no let-up, no chance to prepare, was something Clara would spend years trying to find a way to carry without it cutting her every time she picked it up. One moment, Margaret was standing at the kitchen counter mixing a marinade for the chicken she'd planned for dinner, a dish she'd been making since before Clara was born, and knew well enough to do without looking at a recipe. The next moment, she was on the floor. By the time the ambulance arrived, she was somewhere beyond reach, somewhere the paramedics and then the doctors could observe but not follow. She died at the county hospital 2 days later without having regained consciousness. It happened on a Thursday. Claire had been at school in the middle of a social studies test she had been preparing for all week. Eldon had gotten the call during fourth period when he was up on a ladder in the hallway replacing a ballast in one of the fluorescent light fixtures. He came down the ladder and drove to the hospital and did not call the school until he knew what he knew. The thing about sudden death, the specific cruelty of it, the thing that distinguishes it from the deaths you see coming and can begin to grieve in advance, is that it leaves no time for the word last. No last conversation, no last meal together, no last ordinary morning in which you pay the kind of attention that last things deserve. You don't know it's the last until it already is, and by then the door has closed and there is no reopening it. Clara's last memory of her mother was Margaret handing her a brown paper bag lunch that morning at the kitchen door. The bag was folded down at the top, and Margaret had written CMH on the front in black marker, the way she always did, as if Clara might forget which lunch was hers among the dozens of children bringing brown bags to that school. Clara had taken it without fully looking up from the drawing she was finishing on the kitchen table. A tugboat working through a harbor entrance, rendered in blue ballpoint pen on the back of a flyer from the dentist's office, the whole detailed the wake lines careful. She had not said a real goodbye. That was the thing she carried, not the grief itself, which was enormous, and which she learned to organize over the years into something she could live alongside, but the specific weight of that missed moment. The ordinary morning she hadn't paid enough attention to, because there was no reason to, because there had always been tomorrow. Eldon Holt did his best after that. Everyone in Grayfield used that phrase about him with the sympathetic resignation that small towns develop when they are describing situations that resist easy solution. He did his best. He showed up. He cooked dinner, simple things, things he had learned to make well enough that they didn't require concentration that he could produce while moving through the kitchen on a kind of muscle memory that left his mind available for whatever it was doing in the other place. It had started going. He attended Clara's school events. He signed the permission slips. He remembered her birthday and made sure there was a cake, even if the cake came from the grocery store, and was decorated with a generic sentiment he hadn't written himself. He packed her lunches, though he never wrote her initials on the bag. But something in him had gone quiet in a way that went deeper than his natural quietness. Margaret had been the specific gravity around which his words had organized themselves, the person whose presence made his silence comfortable rather than empty, whose attention gave his attention somewhere to go. Without her, the words scattered and settled wherever they happened to land, and mostly they stayed there. By the time Claire was 15, she had learned to move through the house the way you move through a space in the dark carefully, without disturbing anything finding the path by feel, because the light had changed and the old orientations no longer worked the same way. She got a job at 16. Decker Marine Supply was a 45-minute bus ride from Grayfield, set just outside the city limits of Carthage, along a stretch of highway that held a feed store, a tire place, and not much else. The building was long and low, set back from the road behind a gravel parking lot that filled with trucks on weekends and was mostly empty on weekdays, with a hand-painted sign above the entrance that had been touched up so many times over the years that the letters were slightly different thicknesses, the D and the M bolder than the rest from a recent coat, the ampersand thinner, the whole thing readable and imperfect and entirely honest about itself. Inside, boat parts, marine hardware, navigation instruments, safety equipment, charts, rope, the kind of specialized inventory that had a smell machine oil and the faint salt ghost of water that had never actually been anywhere near the store, but existed in the materials nonetheless. In the fiberglass and the marine epoxy and the rubber gaskets, a memory of the ocean encoded in things manufactured for it. The owner was Earl Decker. Earl was 62 years old, former United States Coast Guard rescue swimmer, which meant he had spent his 20s being put into the ocean in bad conditions to pull people out of it, and which had given him the specific patience of a man who has learned that urgency and panic are not the same thing, and that the second one is almost always counterproductive. He had a gray crew cut, trimmed close and kept that way, and forearms that told the story of 40 years of physical work without his having to say a word about it. He wore the same style of khaki work shirt every day. Not the same shirt, he owned several, but the same style because he had found the thing that worked and saw no reason to revisit the decision. He had been running Decker Marine Supply for 20 years with the deliberateness of a man who has identified his purpose and is executing it without drama. He did not give Clara the job because he felt sorry for her. He had been told she was coming. A teenager from Grayfield needed part-time work, was reliable and interested in boats, and he had said he'd talk to her, which was not the same as saying he'd hire her. He gave Clara the job because in the 30 minutes she spent waiting in the shop before her interview, she picked up the parts catalog from the counter and read it. And when Earl came out from the back and asked what she thought of the inventory, she said, "Why do you stock two different marine epoxies at this price point when the cheaper one has better adhesion ratings for steel below the waterline?" Earl looked at her for a moment. "How do you know what adhesion ratings matter for below the waterline?" "I read about it," Clara said. "Hull construction forms. I've been going through them. It's interesting." "How long have you been going through them?" "A few years," Clara said. Earl looked at her for another moment. "You take the bus from Grayfield?" "Yes, sir." "That's 45 minutes each way?" "Yes, sir." "You do that 5 days a week?" "I'd do it 6 if you had the hours for it." Earl hired her that afternoon for 3 days a week, which became 4 within the month, and stayed at 4 through the 3 years she worked for him. Not because he couldn't use more hours, but because she was still in school, and Earl was of the opinion that school had its purposes, and that a person who found those purposes could pursue them without his interfering. Over those 3 years, Clara Holt learned more about boats at Decker Marine Supply than most people learn in a lifetime of owning them. She learned from the catalogs and the technical manuals she borrowed from Earl's shelves and returned with careful penciled notes in the margins. She learned from the customers who came in knowing exactly what they needed, and the customers who came in knowing only that something was wrong and needing someone to help them identify what. She learned from Earl himself, who taught in the way of people who have been doing a thing for a very long time, not through formal instruction, but through demonstration and the specific kind of comment that trusts you to understand it without elaboration. She learned that ropes are called lines on a boat, and that the difference matters in an emergency because you do not have time to point and say that rope thing. She learned to splice a 3-strand line and a braided line, and to do it by feel and low light, working the strands through each other with the patient rhythm of someone who has done it enough times that the hands know the sequence without the mind having to supervise. She learned to read a tide chart to identify a vessel by its hull form at a distance, to understand the relationship between freeboard and displacement and stability, to know what a bilge pump does and what happens to a boat when one seizes at the moment it's needed most. She learned that a boat is a system. Earl taught her the thing he believed most deeply about systems, that if you can understand how a system works, you can fix it. And if you cannot see the system, if you can only see the effects of it, the symptoms, the surface manifestations of the failure, then you are at its mercy. A boat is a system. An engine is a system. A house, a farm, a business, a family, all systems, all subject to the same basic principles of input and output and feedback and failure, all repairable by someone who takes the time to understand them rather than simply reacting to what they see. Clara listened to everything. She was the kind of employee that any employer who has been in business long enough would recognize on sight, the one who shows up early enough that she has already dealt with whatever needs dealing with before you arrive, who stays late without being asked because the job isn't done. And leaving a job undone is a kind of dishonesty she doesn't know how to live with. She reorganized the hardware wall by both part number and application, which quietly dismantled Earl's previous system without his noticing, until a month had passed, and he realized he had not spent 20 minutes hunting for a specific fitting in weeks. She saved every dollar she earned. Old Folgers can back of her closet behind the shoe rack, where there was enough shadow that you wouldn't notice it unless you were looking. The same instinct her mother had shown with the drawings, the quiet, undemonstrative sense that some things are worth holding on to, even before you know exactly why, even before the reason makes itself visible. By the time she was 17, the coffee can held $880. By the time she was 18, it held $1,140. And then, toward the end of her third year at Decker Marine Supply, something happened that she would not fully understand for another year and a half, not until she was kneeling in the bilge of a Georgia houseboat with a hacksaw in her hand and a 40-year secret at her feet. On a slow Tuesday afternoon in October, when the shop was empty and the light coming through the front windows had the particular honey gold quality of a Mississippi autumn, that specific late afternoon angle that makes everything it touches look considered deliberate chosen, Earl came out from the back office with something in his hand. A piece of paper folded twice the creases worn soft with age, the paper itself slightly yellowed at the edges. He set it on the counter in front of Clara without explanation. She looked at it, then at him. "Open it," Earl said. She unfolded it. It was a letter, handwritten in a looping, careful cursive that Clara recognized the way you recognize a piece of music you haven't heard in years, not consciously first, but somewhere below the level of conscious thought, in the place where the oldest memories live before the mind catches up to them. The handwriting was her mother's. The date at the top was March 2009, 3 years before Margaret died. Clara had been 7 years old. "Dear Mr. Decker," the letter began, "my name is Margaret Holt. You do not know me. I am writing because I have a daughter who is 7 years old and who draws boats the way other children draw houses, with a specificity and a seriousness that I do not believe she is old enough to fully understand yet. I am not certain I fully understand it either, but I know enough to know that she is drawing toward something, something she doesn't have words for and I don't have words for, but that shows up clearly in everything she puts on paper. I am writing to ask whether, if that something should ever bring her to your door, you might consider pointing her in the right direction. I have read about your shop and about your background. I believe you are the kind of man who would know what the right direction was for a girl like this, with this particular kind of attention and this particular pull toward the water. I don't know when she'll come or if she'll come, but she draws boats the way people draw the things they're looking for without knowing they're looking. So I am writing this in the hope that when she arrives, you are there. Sincerely, Margaret Holt, Grayfield, Mississippi." Clara read it once at normal speed. Then she went back to the beginning and read it again slowly, the way you read something when you need to confirm it is real. Going over each word, testing its weight against what you know about the person who wrote it, asking the question that the reading cannot answer, which is how. How her mother had known when Clara was 7 years old that this particular man at this particular supply store 45 miles away was someone worth writing to. How she had imagined from so far away and so many years ahead that Clara would end up here. How she had looked at a 7-year-old girl drawing boats on the backs of grocery bags and understood not just what the girl liked, but where the liking was pointed, what it was moving toward, where it intended to arrive. It was real. Her mother had written this letter in 2009. She had written it, sealed it, addressed it, put it in the mail, and then, as far as anyone could tell, never mentioned it again. She had not told Clara. She had not apparently told Eldon. She had simply done the things she believed needed doing and then trusted the world to do its part. Building a net before Clara knew she was going to fall. Clara did not cry in the shop that day. She had used most of her crying in the year and a half after her mother died, had worked through the acute phase of it with the thoroughness of someone who understands that grief postponed is grief stored, and storing it does not make it smaller. But her throat was tight in a way that made speech difficult, and she did not try to speak. Earl did not press her. He just picked up the letter when she set it down, refolded it along its old creases, and returned it to his shirt pocket. "She knew you," he said, "not elaborately, not with any of the additions that would have diminished it. Just that," and then he went back to work. Has there ever been someone who planned a future for you before you knew you'd need one? Who looked at you, really looked the way some people look at the water or the land or the long horizon line, and saw not just who you were, but who you were going to become, and quietly arranged things accordingly? That is what Margaret Holt did. And that is what Clara May Holt was still learning the full shape of years later, when the last of what she had left in the world disappeared in the space of 11 days. Eldon Holt died on Clara's 19th birthday, April 14th, 2020, a Monday. The evening news was on the same program he had watched every evening at the same time for as long as Clara could remember. He had been sitting in his brown corduroy recliner, the recliner he had occupied every evening since Margaret died, in the same position facing the same wall visible from the kitchen when you came in the back door, and he had simply stopped. A cardiac arrest, sudden, complete, without warning or preamble. By the time Clara came home from her closing shift at the supply shop and found him, the program had changed twice, and the room was very still, and Eldon Holt had the expression of a man who has been permitted finally to set down a burden that had been growing heavier for 8 years. He had not suffered. The paramedics confirmed it when they came. The cardiac event had been massive and immediate. He would not have been conscious for more than a few seconds. Claire was grateful for that, in the specific, complicated way you are grateful for things that should not require gratitude. That death, when it came, was clean. She sat across from him for a while before she called anyone, because there was no urgency now and she needed the time. The television cast blue light across the room. Outside, a neighbor's dog barked twice at something in the dark and then went quiet. She sat with her hands in her lap and let the room be what it was. She had been watching her father fade for 8 years. Not dramatically, not in the way that makes scenes or demands attention or gives grief a clear target. He had simply been going the way a photograph left too long in the light. Go still recognizable, still present in outline, but progressively less detailed. Progressively further from the vivid original, until you look up one day and realize that what you are looking at is a copy of a copy and the original is gone. Now the process was finished. That was all. The going had arrived at its destination. She called the ambulance. She answered the questions. She signed the forms. She called Earl because there was no one else to call, no one else in her life who occupied the particular position of trusted adult, and Earl said he would be there in 45 minutes, and he was. What followed was the mechanical business of death in a small town. Arrangements. A service at the Methodist Church on Clement Street, where the bell tower was still under repair and had been for 16 years. A burial in the town cemetery beside the plot where Margaret had been placed in 2012. The headstones now a matched pair, the grass between them the same grass as everywhere else. A handful of people from the school and from the church and from the diner came. Some of them had known Eldon for 30 years, and spoke about him with genuine warmth and accurate detail. Some of them had known him casually and said the respectful things that people say at funerals when they have come, because it is right to come and do not want to leave without offering something. Clara stood through all of it with her hands at her sides and her face composed. She accepted the handshakes and the brief embraces and the expressions of condolence with the specific grace of someone who understands that other people's discomfort with death is real and that helping them through it is a form of courtesy she can afford. Then it was over. The landlord's name was Gerald Mosswood. He owned 4 rental properties in Grayfield, the Holt House, and 3 others, and managed them with the administrative efficiency of a man who had decided at some point in his 40s that sentiment and real estate do not coexist productively, and that operating on that principle, while it sometimes required difficult conversations, produced better outcomes for everyone in the long run. He called Clara 11 days after the funeral. He was not unkind. That was the thing about Gerald Mosswood. The thing that made him easier to deal with than a crueler man would have been he was not unkind. He was simply realistic, and realism sometimes requires saying things that would be easier not to say. The property was going on the market. The lease had ended with Eldon's death. He needed Claire out by the end of the month. He was sorry for her loss, and he meant that. "Your father was a good tenant," he said. "A decent man, but I have to think about the property." "I understand," Clara said. She did understand. Grief does not suspend the ordinary requirements of the world. It does not put the world on hold. The world continues its transactions while grief does whatever grief does, and the person who is grieving has to manage both simultaneously, which is one of the less examined difficulties of the experience. She spent the next week packing. She packed Eldon's belongings into boxes for the Goodwill truck, his work clothes worn at the elbows and knees in the specific ways that maintenance work wears clothes, his tools sorted and labeled and wrapped in oilcloth, the automotive manuals stacked in the garage, the ones he had been consulting since the 80s, and which were by now more historical document than practical reference. The hunting vest he had not worn in at least 15 years, the blaze orange faded to a pale coral. She kept 3 things of his. A wool fishing sweater, dark green, thick knit, the kind designed for cold water and hard weather. It still carried something of him in the fibers, not his cologne, which he had never worn, but the particular combination of machine oil and something else she had never identified, but which meant Eldon to her the way certain smells mean certain people without any rational accounting for why. She pressed her face into it once standing at the edge of the closet and then folded it carefully and put it in the backpack. A framed photograph taken in the summer of 1998 at a lake in Tennessee that she did not know the name of. Her parents standing at the water's edge, squinting into the afternoon sun, her mother laughing at something off to the left of the camera's frame. Her father in the specific way of a man who does not photograph naturally, almost smiling, almost there. His face in the process of becoming something warmer than his usual expression caught mid-arrival. She wrapped the frame in a flannel shirt and wedged it into the duffel bag. And the coffee can. The coffee can now held $1,128. 3 years of saving at Decker Marine, plus what remained from various other sources, overtime hours, occasional odd jobs on weekends, the cash she had been given by relatives of diminishing closeness at birthdays and Christmases over the years. She had not spent freely. She had never had a reason to spend freely, and so she had not. She packed her own life into the backpack and the duffel bag. Books, the boat building manuals she had borrowed from Earl's shelves, and been allowed to keep the field guides to coastal birds and salt marsh ecology she had been reading since she understood she was moving toward water. Work clothes. The clipboard with its current drawing, a catch-rig sailing vessel she had been working on for 3 weeks, developing from a design she'd found in a 1970s boat-building magazine in the back of Earl's shop. Her rain jacket, a handful of photographs, and then on the last night before the lease ended, she went through the drawers. Not with any specific purpose, just checking the way you check when you are leaving a place permanently and want to be certain that nothing important has been left behind. The kitchen drawers, the bedroom drawers, the end table beside the recliner where Eldon had kept his television remote, and his reading glasses, and various small things he had meant to deal with later and had not always gotten around to. In the bottom of the end table drawer, beneath a folded grocery receipt and a pocket-sized address book that hadn't been updated since the early 2000s, she found a small dark blue notebook. Not Eldon's handwriting. She knew that before she fully registered the fact. Eldon's handwriting was angular and cramped, the handwriting of a man who had spent decades filling out maintenance work orders with a pen that was perpetually half empty, pressing harder than necessary to get the ink to flow. This was different. Flowing deliberate, the cursive of someone who had been properly taught penmanship and had maintained the practice because they believed that how you wrote said something true about you. Her mother's handwriting. The notebook was half-filled. The entries had no consistent dates and no obvious organizing structure. Margaret had used it the way some people use a journal, not as a record of days, but as a place to put thoughts that needed to be somewhere other than in her head before they could become plans. Ideas set down so they wouldn't dissipate before she had figured out what to do with them. Most of the entries were ordinary, fragments of recipes she had been developing or wanted to try. Reading lists, some of which Clara recognized as authors or titles, Margaret had gone on to actually read some of which remained aspirational. Notes about the garden she had tended behind the house, which beds needed amendment in the spring, which varieties of tomato had done well in the summer's particular heat, what she planned to try differently next year. But near the back of the notebook, on a page that had been folded once and then smoothed carefully open and flat again, the kind of folding and unfolding that happens when you have gone back to something multiple times, consulting it, confirming it, Clara found 3 lines, written in her mother's hand. Nothing before them on the page, nothing after. Just 3 lines like coordinates. Georgia coast, Brunswick Inlet, Ray Decker, Earl's brother. The water there. Clara stared at the page. Earl had a brother named Ray. She knew this. Earl mentioned him with the comfortable infrequency of a man who has a sibling he is close to, without needing to talk about the closeness. The younger brother who had gone south instead of staying in Mississippi, who ran a marine repair shop on the Georgia coast, who could, as Earl had said more than once in the 3 years she had worked for him, teach you things about boats from the inside out that no parts catalog in the world could teach you. Clara had never had a particular reason to think much about Ray Decker, had never had a reason to think about Brunswick, Georgia, which was a city she would have been able to locate on a map, but had no specific knowledge of and no connection to. But her mother had. Her mother had written his name in this notebook, in this house, in this drawer, that Clara was only now going through because she was leaving the place forever and wanted to be certain she hadn't left anything important behind. Had written his name alongside a specific location, a specific inlet, a specific piece of water on a specific piece of Georgia coastline 2 states south of Grayfield, Mississippi. Her mother had not only written Earl Decker a letter asking him to watch for Clara. She had gone further than that. She had identified a destination, a specific person, a specific direction. She had done the research, Earl's brother, his location, the nature of the work, and she had written it down so it would be there to be found. She had drawn her daughter a map. And Clara May Holt, 19 years old, standing in an empty living room in a house she was leaving the next morning with a backpack and a bungee-corded duffel bag and $1,128 in a coffee can, had just found it on the last night of the last chance to find it. She did not cry, but she sat down on the floor of the living room with the notebook in her lap and the television off and the house very quiet around her, and she thought about the specific patient love of a woman who had known her daughter so completely and so clearly that she had prepared a path forward years before Clara would need it. A path that Clara was now standing at the beginning of 8 years after Margaret had stopped being able to walk it with her. She sat for a long time. Then she called Earl. Brunswick, she said. A pause on the line. Ray's place, Earl said. Not a question. She wrote it down. In a notebook I found tonight. Ray Decker, Brunswick Inlet. The water there. I don't know when she wrote it. I don't know exactly how she knew about it, but it's there in her handwriting. A longer pause. The kind of pause that means a person is thinking about something they have already thought about many times before and are now thinking about in a different context. I'll call him tonight, Earl said. He'll know you're coming. Earl, Clara said, I don't know what I'm looking for. No, Earl said, but she did, and that's enough to start with. She pulled the door of the house shut behind her at 7 the following morning. She stood on the porch for a moment and looked at the door. The paint on it, the same paint that had been there when she was brought home from the hospital in 2001, touched up twice but not replaced the color. A dark green that had faded at the exposed edges and remained deeper in the sheltered corners. She thought about all the times that door had opened and closed behind everyone she had ever loved, and about the fact that it would open and close for someone else now, for people she didn't know. And that was simply the nature of places, that they continue without you, that they accommodate whoever comes next. She picked up her bags and walked to the bus stop. The bus to Carthage left at 8. The connection south with a transfer in Atlanta left at 10:15. She did not look back. She had never been to Georgia. She had been to Tennessee once in the summer of the photograph, the lake, her mother laughing, her father almost smiling. She had been to Arkansas twice for a school competition in 7th and 8th grade. She had been to the Gulf Coast of Mississippi on a 5th grade field trip that she remembered primarily for the smell of the water when they got close enough to the coast to feel the change in the air. Salt and diesel and something organic and ancient. A smell that the stock pond behind the Holt property had never produced in any season or condition. That smell had stayed with her for years. She had never been able to fully explain why it mattered to her the way it did. The bus south from Atlanta crossed into Georgia in the early afternoon. The land was flat for a long time, the road cutting through second-growth pine forests, and then it began to change. The pines thickened and grew taller, the canopy rising until the highway ran through a corridor of shadow, even at midday, the light filtering down in shifting columns. There were stretches where the road crossed over narrow brown water creeks, and the water below the bridges was very still and very dark and perfectly reflective, and Clara pressed her face to the window glass and watched it pass beneath her. By the time the bus reached the outskirts of Brunswick, the light was entirely different from anything she had seen before. The amber-green quality of it filtered through the canopy of live oaks that lined the older streets, thickened and slowed by the humidity that the surrounding marshes breathed out continuously, a light that moved slightly and constantly, and was never quite the same from one moment to the next. Unlike anything she had grown up with, and yet somehow not entirely unfamiliar. The way a place can feel like a place you have imagined without knowing you were imagining it. The bus station in Brunswick was a low concrete building with plastic seats and a vending machine and a single window that looked out onto a parking lot. She stepped off the bus into an afternoon that was warm and wet and smelled of salt and cord grass and the particular richness of tidal water in late spring, and she stood on the sidewalk with her bags and her coffee can and waited. Ray Decker was already there. He was leaning against the passenger side of a silver F-25. Oh, that had seen better decades. The front quarter panel on the driver's side had been repainted at some point in a blue that was close to, but not quite the original silver, and the rear bumper carried a long, horizontal scrape along its bottom edge that had been there long enough to develop its own rust, a permanent record of some ancient contact with something immovable. He was roughly his brother's height, but heavier through the shoulders, built the way men are built when their work has been primarily physical for 30 or more years. He had a gray-brown beard that he had not been particularly attending to, and he was wearing the same style of work boots that Earl wore, the leather at the toes scuffed beyond recovery. He nodded when she came through the door. Clara May, he said. Mr. Decker. Ray, he said. He reached for the duffel bag on her shoulder without asking, took it, put it in the truck bed. Earl says you know your stuff. Earl is generous. Earl doesn't do generous, Ray said. He does accurate. He didn't say much else. He drove with one hand on the wheel and one elbow out the open window and let the warm, salt-thickened evening air do most of the talking, which suited Clara. She was tired from the bus, tired in the bone-deep way of someone who has been running on logistics and forward motion for weeks, and is only now, with the immediate decisions made and the next step underway, beginning to feel the weight of what has been happening. They left the city behind and traveled south on a two-lane road through marshland that seemed to go on indefinitely in every direction, an enormous flat world of cordgrass and dark water dissected by the road and interrupted only occasionally by a stand of pine or a cluster of live oaks trailing Spanish moss in long gray curtains. The sky above the marsh was the kind of sky that only exists over very flat, open ground near water, a sky with genuine scale, with clouds that had room to be architectural, a sky that reminded you of how much sky there actually was and how little of it you normally saw. Clara watched all of it through the window. After about 15 minutes, Ray spoke. "Frank's boat," he said. "Earl tell you anything about it?" "He said it belonged to a man who died, that there were back fees on the slip." $10, Ray said. "Marina was going to sell it for scrap. I told him I'd hold it a while." He paused, and in the pause was something specific, something considered. "Figured someone might come for it." He said it the way people say things when they mean something more particular than the words contain, not vague but compressed, waiting to see if the listener would understand the compression or need it expanded. Clara did not ask him to expand it. The repair shop was 10 more miles south, down a dirt track through scrub oak that opened onto a yard at the water's edge. The shop itself was a large, open-sided structure with a corrugated metal roof, the kind of building designed to do its job, and nothing else functional to its bones, comfortable in its purposefulness. Concrete floors, tools on pegboards, engines on stands, and dollies in various states of disassembly. The smell of the place was layered in specific diesel and fiberglass, in marine epoxy and salt air and machine oil, all of it combined into something that Clara, who had been working with these materials for 3 years, found as close to comfortable as any smell she knew. A dock extended from the back of the property into the inlet. A flat-bottomed John boat was tied at the near end. A cabin cruiser with waterline growth on its side sat in the middle. An aluminum center console with a missing outboard bracket was at the far end. And beyond the center console, at the very end of the dock, listing 2 or 3 degrees to port, was the houseboat. Clara set her bags down and walked to the end of the dock. 30 feet of steel-hulled vessel, once painted white, now a comprehensive record of rust. Not decorative rust, not the photogenic patina of something that could be called weathered. Real rust, deep oxidation that had worked its way through the surface coating to the metal beneath, leaving the hull pitted and rough, showing bare metal in several places along the waterline where the deterioration had gone furthest. The wooden cabin above the hull had been painted pale blue at some point, and some of that paint remained in the sheltered angles of the trim work, but the exposed surfaces were bare gray wood, swollen with years of humidity, the planking gapped and fibrous. One window was cracked. A wire ran from an exterior outlet to nowhere in particular, its purpose lost. The deckboards visible through the open stern had gaps between them from years of drying and contracting. An old life ring hung from the stern rail on a rope that could not have been trusted with any weight worth mentioning. The whole boat sat low in the water, not dangerously, not with the acute alarm of something about to go under, but with the heavy, weary lowness of a structure that has been holding itself together through sustained effort and is beginning to accumulate the cost of that effort in ways that show. But Clara saw something else. She saw the hull shape beneath the rust, the way the steel curved up from the keel and flared at the chine, the geometry of a hull designed for stability in slow water work for floating rather than speed. She saw that the steel was thick and properly framed, that the hull had been built with the redundancy of something designed to last, and that the years of surface deterioration, however comprehensive, had not reached the structure. She saw the cabin bones beneath the ruined planking, the corner posts solid at their bases, the roof framing sound where she could see it through the open cabin door. Whoever had built this boat had built it right decades ago, with the care of someone who understood that the work you put in at the beginning is the work that carries everything that comes after. It was a wreck. It was floating. It was fixable. $10, Clara said. Ray was standing beside her. $10, he confirmed. She opened the coffee can. She counted 10 $1 bills from the stack inside, placing them one at a time into Ray Decker's open hand without ceremony and without hesitation. He looked at the money for a moment and then at her. "You know how to caulk a seam," he said. "Yes. Mix 2-part epoxy for steel. Phosphate primer first, then the epoxy. Feather the edges into the surrounding surface. Thicker than peanut butter, you want it to stay where you put it." A pause. "You know what to do if you find a hole breach below the waterline. Pump the bilge. Identify the source. Patch from outside if access allows inside with thickened epoxy and a woodbacker if it doesn't." Ray was quiet for a moment. Then, for the first time since she had met him, something in his expression moved not into a full smile, but toward the threshold of one. The expression of a man who is not easily surprised, and is finding himself surprised, and is taking that seriously. He handed her a key. "Bunk in the cabin tonight. We'll start on the bilge in the morning." Clara took the key. She walked back to the end of the dock and stepped aboard. The deck gave slightly under her weight, not alarmingly, not the alarmed flex of something about to fail, but the accommodating give of a structure that has learned over many years of floating to absorb what comes to it. She unlocked the cabin door and pushed it open. The interior was a single room roughly 10 feet by 12, the dimensions of a generous walk-in closet or a very small bedroom. A built-in bunk ran along the starboard wall, its mattress compressed and stained with years of use and abandonment. A galley counter along the port side with a 2-burner propane stove, the regulator corroded to the point where using it would have required optimism. Clara didn't feel like indulging. A folding table, 2 mismatched chairs, a row of overhead cabinets along the forward bulkhead, the doors humidity swollen to the point where they no longer closed quite flush, standing open at a uniform half-inch gap that gave the row a slightly surprised expression. The smell was mildew and old fabric, and the particular sweetness that water-damaged wood develops after enough years in humid air. Not unpleasant, exactly more complex than unpleasant, the smell of something that has been somewhere a long time and has accumulated the texture of that time in its cells. Clara set her backpack on the table. She stood in the middle of the cabin and turned slowly, taking in every surface, the way Earl had taught her to take in unfamiliar equipment, not hunting for what was wrong, but first understanding what was there, what the thing was before you decided what needed to be done about it. The walls were close. The ceiling was low. The light coming through the 2 dockside windows was the filtered water-green gold light of late afternoon in a marsh, a light that moved slightly and constantly because the water moved, and the cordgrass moved, and the Spanish moss moved, and the light filtered through all of it was never quite still. Clara felt standing in the middle of that small ruined room, something she would not have had a word for if you had asked her to name it. Not happiness, not comfort, something older and more specific than either of those. Recognition. Like a key finding the lock it was made for. Like a word heard for the first time that describes something you have known your whole life without having had the language to describe it. Like arriving somewhere you have been moving toward since before you knew you were moving. She slept on the floor that first night in her sleeping bag, the rotted mattress pushed against the wall to give her room. The marsh outside was alive with sound, a deep layered chorus of frogs she had never heard in Mississippi. The distant call of something perched in the live oaks, the low and constant lap of dark water against the steel hull beneath her, a sound so consistent it became after a while not a sound at all, but simply the tone of the place, the pitch at which this particular part of the world vibrated. A splash near the bow, sudden and close, that might have been a fish, or might have been something larger and more patient, going about its business without reference to what the land was doing. She lay awake for a long time listening, and at some point, without knowing exactly when the transition happened, she stopped feeling afraid of the sounds. She started feeling held. Ray came at first light the following morning with coffee in a steel thermos, in a brown paper bag from a diner called Nell's on the main road, a place that had been producing the same breakfast since before Ray had moved to Brunswick, and that had not felt any pressure to diversify. The biscuits inside the bag were dense and warm and buttery in the specific way of biscuits made by someone who has been making them the same way for 30 years and has arrived at a result they consider finished. They ate on the dock in the cool morning air without speaking much. The inlet was flat and silver in the early light. A great blue heron stood on a half-submerged log 20 yards off the port bow, absolutely motionless, one leg drawn up its entire posture, a study in committed patience. The patience of a creature that has made its peace with waiting, because waiting is the most productive form of effort it has available. Ray poured coffee into the thermos cap and handed it to Clara. "Bilge first," he said. "You need to see what's down there before anything else makes sense." "I know," Clara said. She finished her coffee. She went aboard and lifted the hatch in the cabin floor that accessed the bilge space below. The bilge held about 6 inches of dark, still water at its lowest point, accumulated over the years since Frank's death, seeping in through whatever the hull had developed in its time, sitting unattended. Not catastrophic. Not the kind of problem that meant the boat was a lost cause. The kind of problem that exists to teach you where the boat has been letting the world in. Clara lowered herself through the hatch. The space was cramped below. She could not stand, could barely kneel without her back contacting the frames above her. The hull walls close enough on both sides that she was constantly aware of them. She worked with the flashlight in one hand and a bail bucket in the other, scooping the dark water in slow, rhythmic strokes and passing the bucket up through the hatch to Ray, who emptied it overboard and passed it back down. It was close, uncomfortable work. Her shoulders ached within the first hour from the angle at which she was working, bent under the low ceiling, the arms moving in a plane that the shoulder joint was not designed to maintain for extended periods. The bilge smelled of rust and confined water in the mineral darkness of an enclosed metal space that hadn't seen air in too long. She did not stop. She was deep in the third hour, the water level dropping toward the bilge floor, when her flashlight found something. Dark wood, brass at the corner, the dark tongue of a leather strap. Clara held the flashlight steady. The object was sitting on a wooden platform built up from the bilge floor, a simple construction of 2x4s nailed together into a low rectangle to elevate whatever sat on top of it above the waterline. The platform was soft now, the wood gray with years of moisture, the nails darkened with rust. But the object it supported was different. A footlocker. Military style, roughly 30 inches long, 18 wide. Wood body, dark stained with brass hardware at each corner tarnished to a deep brown but solid, not pitted, not compromised. Leather straps crossed the lid and buckled at the front. A heavy padlock secured the hasp. The lock was rusted, the keyhole furred with oxidation. But the footlocker itself, the body, the brass, the leather had been maintained at some point, cared for, protected. The person who had built the platform to keep it dry had understood what they were protecting. They had taken the time to protect it properly. Clara stared at it for a long moment. She climbed out of the bilge, through the cabin, onto the dock. Ray was at his workbench in the shop. He came when she said she needed him to see something. He lowered himself through the hatch and crouched beside the footlocker holding the flashlight while Clara knelt across from him. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Ray ran his thumb slowly along one of the brass corner fittings, then along the leather strap, then turned the padlock in his hand. "Frank," he said. It wasn't a question. "You'll need a hacksaw," Claire said. He went to get one. He came back with a hacksaw, a second flashlight, and a worn pair of leather work gloves, which he put on before he handed Clara the saw. "It's your boat," he said. "You should be the one." It took 11 minutes to cut through the padlock shackle. The steel was rusted through its surface, but the core was still hard, and the hacksaw blade needed to find the right angle in the cramped space. And twice Clara had to stop and reposition her arms when the cramp in her shoulder made the stroke uncontrolled. But she kept at it, the same patience, the same methodical pressure that any task requiring a blade requires. You don't force it. You let the tool do what it was designed to do, and you provide the consistency and the guidance, and you wait for the work to arrive at its conclusion. The shackle gave. The padlock fell to the bilge floor with a dull, flat sound, old metal landing on old wood, a sound without resonance like the period at the end of a very long sentence. Clara sat back on her heels. She looked at the footlocker in the beam of the flashlight. The lid was in front of her. The leather straps were unbuckled. There was nothing holding it closed now except the habit of being closed 40 years of it. And then she understood something that she had not understood 30 seconds earlier, and the understanding made her stop. This was the moment, the one she had seen in her mind in the flash of the flash forward, the one that had been waiting at the center of this story since the morning she first opened her eyes in this cabin. She was here now. The lock was on the floor beside her knee. The lid was in front of her. Everything that had brought her to this dock, to this boat, to this cramped, dark space below the waterline, everything her mother had arranged and everything Frank Meade had left, and everything Earl had kept, and everything Ray had held open, had been moving toward this exact moment. And the moment was now, and she had to open the lid. She lifted it. The inside of the footlocker was dry, completely, entirely, impossibly dry. The oilcloth lining that covered the interior surfaces had held thick, dark, still supple despite the decades, and had kept the contents as protected as the day they were placed inside. Arranged within the oilcloth in careful rows were canvas bags, small bags the size of the coin bags that banks use for sorting, each one tied at the top with a piece of brown twine and labeled with a paper tag attached by a thin wire loop. The kind of tag that used to come on luggage and briefcases in an earlier era. Small rectangular tags of stiff paper with a wire through a small grommet at one end. The ink on the tags had faded to pale brown, but in the flashlight beam and the stillness of the bilge, the writing on each one was legible. Each tag held a year, 1984, then a gap, 1986, 1987, then another gap much later. 1990, 1991, 1993, 1994. Clara picked up the first bag. Heavy. Not dramatically, but substantially the specific weight of metal packed densely in cloth. She untied the twine with the careful movements of someone who is aware that the thing in her hands has been waiting a long time and deserves that awareness. She opened the bag. Coins. Silver coins, old ones, the kind that had been taken out of circulation before Clara was born and before her parents were teenagers. She poured a few into her palm and held the flashlight over them. Walking Liberty, $50, the ones with the striding figure of Liberty on the obverse, the design that many people still considered the most beautiful coin the United States had ever struck. Mercury dimes, small and dense, the winged helmet Liberty on their faces, worn smooth with years of handling. Morgan silver dollars, the size of a modern silver dollar, twice the weight, carrying the specific gravity of silver minted in the decades when the country was still deciding what it wanted to be. She opened a second bag. More silver, different denominations, same quality of care in the selection, as if the man putting these away had been choosing them, not just accumulating whatever came to hand. A third bag. Paper money this time, bills folded in half and secured with a rubber band that had gone brittle but had not yet broken. She unfolded the top bill. A 20 from 1994. Beneath it, a 10 from 1989. Beneath that, various denominations from various years, all of them old, all of them in the kind of condition that suggested they had been put away clean and kept that way. A fourth bag. A mixture of coins and bills, the coins loose, the bills folded. A fifth, quarters. Washington quarters with dates from the mid-1970s through the early 1980s stacked in tight columns inside the bag. She counted them all. 38 bags arranged in chronological order from 1979 to 2018 with 2 gaps in the sequence. No bag labeled 1985, no bag labeled 1992. Every other year was present and accounted for 1 bag per year for almost 4 decades, some heavy, some lighter one from 1981, so sparse that she could feel the coins moving freely inside, and one from 2006 so full that the canvas seams had stretched visibly at the side, gussets straining toward capacity. At the bottom of the footlocker beneath the last canvas bag were two more things. A flag. Folded into the formal triangle, the flag folded at a military funeral. Folded the way it is folded when it is handed to the family that remains the blue field of stars. Outermost the red and white stripes tucked away inside the whole thing, crisp and clean and preserved by the oilcloth that had kept everything else dry. And an envelope. Letter size sealed the flap, gummed shut and holding. The paper had yellowed slightly at the edges, but was otherwise intact. On the front, in a handwriting she had not seen before, small, precise, the handwriting of someone who had been taught penmanship in an era when penmanship was considered a character trait, 5 words. To whoever finds this. Clara held the envelope. She climbed out of the bilge, up through the cabin, out onto the deck into the full morning light. She sat down on the deck boards with her back against the cabin wall and the envelope in her hand, and she opened it. 2 pages written front and back in the same small, careful hand. The date at the top, May 2018. My name is Frank Mead. I was born in Jessup, Georgia in 1930. I served in the United States Army from 1950 to 1952. I was at the Chosin Reservoir. I came home in the spring of 1952 with both my feet and most of my fingers, which was more than I had any right to expect, and which I have been grateful for every morning, since even the mornings when gratitude was the hardest thing I had to locate. I came home with other things too, things that did not have names then and barely have names now. Things I carried in a way that made it difficult to be around other people for very long, because other people needed me to put the things down before they could be comfortable, and I could not put them down, and I could not explain why I could not. The only place I could put them down was on the water. I bought this boat in 1979 for $400. I had been working as a diesel mechanic at the Glynn County Port Facility for 17 years by then, and I had enough money saved for a down payment on a small house, and instead I bought this boat. I did not do this because it was the wise choice. I did it because when I stood on this deck for the first time and felt the water under me and heard the sound the hull makes when the wake from another boat reaches it, that particular low sustained note that steel makes against moving water, I understood that this was the only place I had found in 30 years of looking where the things I was carrying could be set down long enough for me to breathe. Every year since 1979, I have saved what I could in a canvas bag with that year written on the tag. Some years I saved more than others, some years much less. 2 years I saved nothing at all for reasons I am not going to explain in this letter, though. If you look at the bags and notice which years are missing, and if you think about what those years might have meant for a man living alone on a boat, you may be able to imagine what those years held without my having to put it into words. Some things are better left to be imagined by the person who finds them. They will imagine it truer than I could write it. I do not have children. I have no siblings living. The men I served with are gone. There is no one I can leave this to, so I am leaving it to you. I do not know who you are. I do not know what circumstances brought you to this boat, what you were carrying when you came aboard, what you were looking for, or whether you knew you were looking for anything at all. But whoever finds this footlocker came to this vessel for a reason, even if the reason is not yet clear to them. Maybe you needed a place to be. Maybe you were trying to build something. Maybe you were simply lost and moving in a direction that felt right even when you couldn't explain it to anyone else. I was all 3 of those things at various times, and this boat held all 3 of them. I am leaving this in the hope that it helps, in the hope that it buys you time to figure out what you came here to figure out. Take care of this boat. She has more in her than she looks like she does. She always has. Frank Mead, May 2018. Clara read it once at a normal pace. Then she went back to the beginning and read it again slowly, the way you read something when the reading itself is a form of respect. She folded the letter carefully along its original creases and returned it to the envelope. She sat on the deck with the envelope in her hand, in the morning coming fully in over the marsh, and she thought about Frank Mead. Born in 1930, 20 years old at the Chosin Reservoir in the winter of 1950, in the specific brutal cold of that particular winter, in that particular part of Korea, a cold that soldiers who survived it would describe for the rest of their lives with a kind of involuntary precision because the body does not forget the cold that nearly killed it. Coming home in 1952 at 22 years old, with his feet and his fingers in a head full of things that had no names. Finding 27 years later a 30-foot steel-hulled boat on a Georgia inlet and understanding standing on its deck for the first time that this was the place. Spending 40 years building up something to leave, not knowing who he was leaving it to, just building it anyway. Ray came and stood beside her on the deck. She handed him the letter. He read it standing up in the morning light, and when he was done, he handed it back without saying anything. He looked at the footlocker which she had brought up from the bilge and set on the deck. "There are 2 bags missing," Clara said, 1985 and 1992. Ray looked at the bags arranged in their rows, then at the gaps. "I know which years those are," he said. "Will you tell me?" "Not yet," Ray said. "There's someone who should tell you that when the time is right." She accepted this. She had learned in the 3 years at Earl's shop that some things resolve in their own time, and that pushing the time does not improve the resolution. A coin dealer Ray knew in Savannah, a man named Aldous Thin and Precise, who had been appraising silver for 30 years and who drove down 2 days later in a sedan. Older than Clara, sat with the footlocker open on the dock table for 4 hours, working through each bag with a battered reference guide and a jeweler's loop, checking dates and mint marks and grade conditions, making notes in the margins of a small spiral notebook he kept in his jacket pocket. When he was finished, he gave Clara his written assessment. Coins $31,400 in silver melt value conservatively assessed. Paper currency face value approximately $16,800 with some bills carrying a modest collector premium. Total approximately $48,200. $48,200. 1 bag per year. 38 years of quiet, steady accumulation in a wooden box below the waterline. Clara opened a bank account in Brunswick 3 days later. The branch manager, a woman named Delia, who had worked that branch for 22 years and had in that time seen most of what a branch bank sees, read Frank's letter when Clara offered it by way of explanation. She read it twice with the same deliberateness Clara had and handed it back without comment. She opened the account. "You going to fix the boat?" Delia asked. "Already started," Clara said. "What does it mean when a man leaves everything he owns to a stranger he will never meet? What does it mean to save money you know you will not spend for a person you know you will not know, in the faith that someone worth leaving it to will eventually arrive? It means something about hope, not the kind of hope that is attached to a specific outcome that rises and falls with whether the specific outcome happens. The quieter kind, the kind that says, I will do the work regardless. I will put the thing in place regardless. And I will trust that the world is not so indifferent that it will go entirely to waste. That kind of hope is harder than the other kind. It requires more. Frank Mead had it for 40 years. Ren Decker arrived that Friday evening in a 10-year-old Civic with a Savannah Law School sticker on the rear window and a messenger bag stuffed to capacity with case files she had not yet finished reviewing. She was 22 years old, Ray's sister's daughter, spending the summer working part-time at a Brunswick law office while finishing her third year's coursework. The property law tracked the track she had chosen because she had understood early that property was where most of the real conflicts happened. She was angular and precise, with Ray's dark eyes and none of his silence. She talked the way people talk who have recently discovered that words are tools and are still calibrating how many of them to use at once. She set the Boyd Crane documents on Ray's kitchen table and read through them, standing up messenger bag still on her shoulder because she hadn't stopped moving long enough to take it off. The claim was written in the specific way that legal documents are written when their author knows the claim is aggressive, but is betting that the recipient won't have the resources to challenge it effectively. Smooth, confident, thoroughly formatted, presented as a statement of established fact rather than a contested position. Boyd Crane's development group had entered into an acquisition agreement with the marina ownership for multiple slips along the inlet. Frank Mead's slip was included in that agreement. The estate's lease had lapsed upon Frank's death. Under the terms of the original slip agreement, and here was the specific language Crane's attorney had chosen, the berth reverted to marina control upon the lessee's death, absent a formal estate transfer filing which had not been completed. Wren set the documents down. When was the slip agreement signed? I don't know, Clara said. I just bought the boat. The slip was part of the purchase. Ray, Wren said, does the marina keep records going back more than 10 years? Eleanor keeps everything, Ray said. He was at the counter with his coffee. 30 years of files, she says. Possibly more. Can you call her tonight? He could. He did. Eleanor called back within 40 minutes. She had the complete slip file for Frank Mead's birth, including every payment receipt going back to 1979, including a prepayment receipt dated March 2010. Frank Mead had paid 10 years of slip fees in full and cash in March 2010. The receipt was signed by the marina owner of record at the time, a man named Garfield, who had since relocated to North Carolina, and was countersigned by Eleanor herself, who remembered the transaction without prompting because Frank had come in on a Tuesday morning and put a paper bag of cash on her desk and said he didn't want to worry about it anymore. Garfield confirmed the transaction by phone. Frank paid 10 years, he said he didn't want to have to think about it. That was Frank. He liked to settle things. The slip was paid through 2020. The lease had not lapsed. Boyd Crane's entire legal position rested on a premise that was directly contradicted by the marina's own records. Wren set her pen down. He didn't just pay the rent, she said. She looked at Clara. He paid the rent for whoever was going to come next. A silence moved through the room. Ray looked at his coffee. Clara thought about Frank Mead, 79 years old, driving to the marina office in the spring of 2010 and setting a paper bag of cash on Eleanor's desk because he didn't want whoever came next to have to worry about the slip fees. Not knowing who was coming, just knowing that someone should be able to arrive without that particular obstacle in the way. Wren filed the preliminary injunction the following Monday morning at the Glynn County Courthouse, supported by Eleanor's records and Garfield's phone statement, and a cover letter that laid out the factual basis in the specific way that makes an opposing attorney look at a document and understand immediately what they are dealing with. The injunction was granted within the week. Boyd Crane's attorney delivered an acknowledgement without apparent appetite for a fight on the merits. But Clara did not hear from Boyd Crane directly, and twice in the following week she noticed a dark blue sedan parked at the entrance of the dirt road that led to Ray's shop. Not moving, just parked the driver, not visible from where she was. The injunction was granted, but Boyd Crane's options were still being reviewed, and reviewing options was a different thing from abandoning them. She noticed the sedan and kept working. Because the hull was not going to repair itself, and the 60 days Boyd Crane had promised in his first visit had not expired. The legal situation was suspended rather than resolved, and the best response Clara knew to a suspended problem was to make herself as impossible to remove as possible, to put herself into the boat the way Frank had put himself into it year after year, bag after bag, so that whatever Boyd Crane's reviewed options turned out to be the question of whether Clara May Holt belonged on this particular vessel, at this particular dock, would not be a question anyone could answer other than yes. She pulled the houseboat from the water using the winch system Ray had built behind the shop, a cable and block arrangement designed to haul a hull up a set of timberways slowly enough to be controlled. The boat came out of the inlet in the early morning, the hull dripping the full extent of its condition, revealed in daylight for the first time since anyone had taken a serious look at it. It was bad. She had expected bad. The reality was still instructive. The rust along the waterline was not superficial. On the port side in 3 places, and on the starboard bow, the steel plate had been compromised, not breached, but thin enough that a ball-peen hammer struck firmly would produce a sound closer to a drum than to solid metal. There were two areas below the original waterline where previous repairs had been attempted, sheet metal screwed over rust damage and sealed with marine caulk that had dried and cracked and failed in multiple locations. Whoever had made those repairs had done the minimum necessary to remain floating, not the work needed to actually solve the problem. Clara sanded the entire hull. She started with an orbital sander in a 40 grit disc working from stern to bow in overlapping passes, the dust rising in red-brown clouds and the rust coming off in layers, revealing the steel beneath it section by section. She wore a respirator and safety glasses and replaced the disc when it glazed. The work was loud enough that she wore foam plugs in her ears, and the vibration of the tool traveled up through her hands and into her forearms and her shoulders. And at the end of each day, her arms shook from the sustained effort, and her ears rang even with the plugs. Day by day, the rust came off and the bare steel appeared gray-silver in the cool morning light, warming to something closer to bronze in the afternoon sun. There is a satisfaction in this kind of work that is difficult to explain to someone who has not done it. Not the satisfaction of the result that was still weeks away, but the satisfaction of the process itself, of the thing moving, of each pass of the tool producing a visible change in the material of the accumulated passes, adding up to something real. She treated the thin areas with phosphoric acid, which converted the remaining oxidation to iron phosphate, inert stable, a surface that marine epoxy would bond to. She mixed the epoxy to the consistency Ray had described, thicker than peanut butter, until it stays where you put it, and built up the compromised sections in layers, feathering each layer into the surrounding steel, coming back the next morning to sand and feather again. She removed the old sheet metal patches entirely and treated the steel beneath them the same way she had treated everything else. No shortcuts, no minimum. The work that needed doing, done the way it needed to be done. Ray watched without saying much. He corrected her grip on the mixing paddle once wordlessly by taking the paddle from her hand and demonstrating and handing it back. He told her one afternoon at the end of a long session of epoxy work that the port bow section she had rebuilt was better than he had expected. Then he went back to the engine he was working on, and Claire went back to her work, and the comment was enough. It was during the whole work that the community found her. Loretta Sims appeared on a Thursday evening driving a pickup truck with a styrofoam cooler in the bed, wearing a canvas apron she hadn't bothered to take off before leaving the inlet table. Her restaurant on the main road, the one that had been feeding Brunswick and its surrounding area since 1988, with a specific uncompromised Southern cooking that requires actual time and actual attention and does not pretend to be anything other than what it is. She was 65 years old, wide-shouldered and deliberate, with the particular ease of a woman who has been feeding people for decades and has long since stopped needing to make a ceremony of it. She handed Clara a mason jar of Brunswick stew, still warm enough to heat your hands on. "You eat that tonight," she said. "You're too thin for the work you're doing." Clara thanked her. Loretta looked at the houseboat, not with the neutral assessment of someone evaluating property, with something more personal, more specific, the look of someone seeing something that connects to a long and complicated interior story. "Frank always said this boat had more in her than people gave her credit for," she said. She looked at Clara. "Same way he felt about himself, I expect." She came back the following Thursday with cornbread and a container of black-eyed peas. The Thursday after that with a pot roast in a mason jar that Clara ate over 2 days. The Thursday visits settled into the structure of Clara's week as naturally as the tide's regular, reliable, not requiring comment or acknowledgement beyond taking the food and being grateful. Clara understood over those weeks that the Thursday deliveries were not charity. They were a different thing, a promise Loretta was keeping to someone who was no longer around to see her keep it. Hank Pruitt came on a Saturday morning with a blue crab trap under each arm and the particular rolling gait of a man who has spent his working life on small boats in shallow water. His body adapted to the constant minor balance adjustments that such a life requires. He was 62, sun-darkened to a uniform brown with hands that were permanently stained at the knuckle creases from years of handling bait and salt water and the steel wire of crab traps. He fished the Georgia coast for blue crab setting traps in the shallows of the inlets before dawn, and checking them at first light the way his father had done, and his father's father before that, a practice that had survived because it worked, and because some things are worth not fixing. He taught Clara how to set a trap in the shallow water along the grass edge of the dock, how to bait it with chicken necks, the smell of it, the way you position the bait, so the crab has to commit before it can steal and retreat, where along the bank to place the traps so the tide current carried the scent in the right direction, how to check them at first light before the herons and ospreys work the same water and help themselves. Within 3 weeks, Clara had a reliable supply of blue crabs. She steamed them in a pot on the camp stove she had set up on deck. The propane stove inside was still months from being operational with Old Bay and lemon, and the cold beer Ray occasionally left on the dock for her, without comment, and she ate them sitting on the deck in the early morning, watching the sun come up over the marsh. And those mornings were among the most purely good experiences she had. And then there was Chester Vale. Chester was 84 years old, and he had the physical presence of a man who had once been very large and had not entirely shed the fact of it, despite the years and the slowing that comes with them. He had retired from working as a tugboat captain on the Brunswick to Savannah coastal run 30 years earlier, and he walked with a cane that he carried more as an affectation than a necessity, or so it appeared, though. Clara suspected the cane did more work than Chester was willing to acknowledge. He had known Frank Meade since they were both boys growing up in Jessup, Georgia, which was a town of a particular size where you knew everyone, whether you intended to or not, and the knowing accumulated over decades into something denser than friendship. He came to the dock one Sunday afternoon and stood at the end of it, looking at the houseboat for a long time. He said nothing while he was looking. When he finally spoke, it was not to Clara specifically, but to the air in the general direction of the boat. "She looks different," he said. "She will," Clara said. He sat in the folding chair Ray had set out, a camp chair canvas, the kind that folds into a bag, and he watched Clara work, and occasionally, when the moment seemed to call for it, said something about Frank. About the war Frank had never talked about Chosin Reservoir in the winter of 1950, which Chester had not experienced, but which Frank had mentioned in the 60-plus years Chester had known him exactly 3 times each time. The same way, with the same deliberate distance. The way a man mentions something he has decided to carry alone and is not inviting discussion of. "He went in at 20, Chester said one Sunday while Clara was working on the cabin framing above him. "Came back at 22. Whatever happened in between, he kept it. Didn't try to put it into words because he said the words he had weren't equal to it." He paused. Said the only thing that helped was the water. The sound of it. The way it moves all the time but stays in its place. He said living on this boat, the water was always right there under him moving, and that the movement meant something to the part of him that needed something to mean something. He came back the following Sunday, and the one after that, bringing nothing, needing nothing, requiring only the chair and the proximity and the occasional willingness to talk. He had a dog, Chester said another Sunday. A black lab mix he called Sable. Had her for 14 years from a pup. She was the one constant thing on this dock for all those years. He was quiet for a moment. When Sable went the way old dogs go when the body finally stops cooperating, it was quiet on this dock for a long time after. A different kind of quiet than Frank's usual quiet. He left it there. Clara stored it without pressing for more. And then on the 4th Sunday of Chester's visits, when the hull had its second coat of midnight navy and the color was beginning to show what it was going to be. Deep complex, a blue so dark it held its own darkness inside it and changed quality with the light. Chester said something he had clearly been deciding about for several weeks. "He told me something," Chester said. "2 winters ago, we were sitting more or less right here on this dock, though the boat looked different then." He turned the cane in his hands. "Frank said, Chester, when the right person gets to this boat, they'll know exactly what to do with her. I can feel the shape of them already." I said, "Frank, who are you expecting?" He said, "I don't know their name. Don't know when they're coming. But I can feel the shape of them. The way you can feel a weather system before the clouds get here, you can feel the change in the pressure before you can see anything. He set the cane across his knees. I've been looking at the boat this past month, he said. Looking at what you've done to her. He looked at Clara. He was right. Clara stood with a paintbrush in her hand, and the smell of marine enamel around her, and the marsh going golden in the late afternoon light. And she felt something move through her that did not have a simple name. Something between gratitude and grief, and the specific vertigo of understanding that a plan had been in motion around you for longer than you knew. She went back to the hull. There was still work to do. It was during the cabin reconstruction the hull finished. The midnight navy paint dried and sealed the cabin, stripped down to its steel deck and bare framing, that she found the photograph. She had been cleaning the footlocker that morning, not the money, but the box itself, which she had decided to keep. She was working a soft cloth along the interior oilcloth lining, careful at the corners and along the seams when the cloth caught on the lower edge of the end panel. She investigated. The oilcloth had come loose from the wood at one corner, the adhesive finally releasing, after decades not rotted, just done. She lifted the edge carefully. Beneath the oilcloth lining, pressed flat against the wood panel, was a photograph. Black and white. Small wallet size, the kind that photography studios produced in the 1970s and early 1980s, when this format was still in common use. The edges slightly curled from the pressure of years of compression between cloth and wood. In the photograph, a man standing on the deck of a boat in a posture of complete unselfconscious ownership. "This is my place," the posture said, and the saying was so certain that it required no emphasis. He was perhaps 35 years old in the image. He had the lean build of someone whose work is physical and whose body has adapted to the work. And he was looking directly at the camera with an expression that had been earned rather than arranged. The expression of a man who has found the thing he was looking for and is not going to make a fuss about it, but is not going to pretend it isn't true either. On the back, in the small, careful handwriting she now recognized as Frank's. For Margaret, the one who understood. FM 1983. Clara read it twice. She turned the photograph over and looked at the man again. Frank Mead on this deck in 1983, age 53. 37 years before Clara stood on the same deck and felt what she had felt, that specific recognition, that sense of arriving at the place you were always supposed to arrive at. She turned it back. For Margaret, the one who understood. She sat with the photograph until the afternoon light had moved significantly across the cabin floor. Then she walked up to the marina office and asked Eleanor if she could use the phone, and she called Loretta Sims. Loretta arrived 20 minutes later. She sat in Chester's folding chair on the dock and held the photograph without looking at it for a moment, the way you hold something you already know and are preparing yourself to see again. Then she looked at it. Something in her expression settled. "He kept this," she said. "The name on the back," Clara said. "Do you know who he meant?" Loretta was quiet long enough that the question hung in the air between them, taking on weight. "Frank started receiving letters around 1983, she said at last. "Maybe 1984, I'm not certain of the exact date, but around there. He mentioned it to me the way you mentioned something that has surprised you pleasantly, not elaborately, just once in passing, saying that he had been writing to a woman in Mississippi who had read something he'd written, a short piece in a marine journal about living aboard on coastal water. She had written to tell him she understood what he was describing, and could she ask him some things." Clara's hands were still in her lap. "He wrote back," Loretta continued, "and she wrote back to that. And it kept going, for a long time, 20 years or more." She looked at the photograph. "They wrote about boats mostly, about what the water means when you really commit to it, when you live on it instead of just visiting it, about what a person carries and where they put it when there's nowhere else, about quiet and what quiet actually is, and whether it's the same for everyone, or whether some people's quiet is a different quality than other people's." She paused. "Frank told me once that she was the only person he had ever corresponded with in his life, ever, who understood exactly what he was saying without his having to explain it, who read the thing he meant rather than the thing he wrote. Did he know much about her? Clara said. Her circumstances, her family. He knew she was married, Loretta said. Knew she had a daughter she was very specific about, talked about the daughter the way people talk about someone they're watching for signs of a particular kind of thing. He said once that the daughter drew boats. She looked at Clara. He said it like it was a clue to something he hadn't figured out yet. Clara looked at the marsh. The letter stopped, she said, around 2008 or 2009. He thought she had gotten sick, Loretta said. He never found out exactly. The letters just stopped coming, and he wrote twice more, and there was no reply. He didn't pursue it not because he didn't care, but because he understood that sometimes things stop, and the stopping is the thing, and you don't ask more than that. She looked at Clara for a long time. Her name, Loretta said, not asking, beginning to understand. Margaret Holt, Clara said. Grayfield, Mississippi. Loretta was quiet. My mother, Clara said. The dock was very still around them. The cordgrass moved in the warm air. A mullet jumped somewhere off the bow, and the small splash it made was the only sound for a moment. Her mother had been corresponding with Frank Meade for 25 years. The man whose boat Clara now owned, whose money was in the bank account she had opened with Delia's help, whose letter was in her pocket, whose photograph she was holding. Her mother had found him through a piece of writing in a marine journal because Margaret Holt paid attention to things, because she read marine journals the way people read the things they are drawn to without being entirely sure why, and had written to him, and he had written back. And for 2 decades, they had been exchanging letters about the water and what it means and what you carry and where you put it. He had sent her a photograph in 1983. She had kept it somewhere. He had kept his copy, kept it behind the lining of a footlocker, protected by oilcloth, and sealed in the same box as 40 years of careful saving. The woman who understood. Not just Frank's correspondent, Clara's mother. The same woman who had kept a folder of boat drawings in a kitchen drawer. The same woman who had written to Earl Decker in 2009 and asked him to watch for a girl who drew boats. The same woman who had written Ray Decker's name in a notebook and left it in an end-table drawer where her daughter would find it. 3 careful arrangements, 3 threads laid in the right places, all of them pointing toward this dock, toward this boat, toward a rusted hull on a backwater Georgia inlet and 40 years of canvas bags and a letter addressed to whoever finds this. What is the difference between a coincidence and something that was always meant to happen? Clara was not certain she knew. She was starting to feel the shape of the answer, but the shape was large and she needed more time with it. She put the photograph on the shelf above the bunk carefully, with the care you give something you intend to keep, something that deserves a place, and she picked up her tools. 2 days later, Boyd Crane came back. He walked down the dock in the early evening, dressed the same way as the first time, the gray suit jacket, the collared shirt, the impossibly clean shoes, but something in his posture was different. The professional confidence of their first meeting was still there, but it was carrying something beneath it now, something that had come from reading Wren's injunction filing and understanding what it said about his position. He looked at the houseboat for a moment before he spoke. The midnight navy hull, the cabin frame rising above it, the new framing beginning to take shape. You've done real work on her, he said. It's not finished, Claire said. A pause. I want to offer you $15,000, Boyd Crane said. Cash, clean, no conditions attached. You walk away from the slip in the boat, and I do not pursue any further legal avenues. Clara looked at him. That's a generous offer for a $10 boat, she said. I'm not offering it for the boat, Boyd Crane said. I know, Clara said. She looked at the boat, at the hull she had stripped and treated and painted with her own hands. At the cabin framing she was in the middle of building from the steel deck up. At the dock where Chester Vale sat on Sunday mornings and told her things about a man she was coming to know better dead than she had known most people alive. No, she said. Boyd Crane was quiet for a moment. He looked at the photograph she was holding. Frank's photograph, the one of him on this deck in 1983, which she had brought out to study the construction details of the original cabin. He did not ask about it. There are other avenues, he said. My attorney will be in touch. He walked back up the dock without hurrying. The dark blue sedan started and pulled away, and the sound of it diminished into the sound of the marsh. And the marsh took it in and held it and then released it the way the marsh did with all sounds. If you're still with us, and thank you for being still with us, take a second and subscribe to the channel. It helps us keep making stories like this one. And tell us in the comments, have you ever found something that changed how you understood where you came from? We read every single one. Now let's keep going. The court date was a Tuesday in late October. Wren Decker drove herself to the Glenn County Courthouse in the 10-year-old Civic, wearing a suit she had bought for law school recruiting season, and altered herself because the sleeves were half an inch too long, and the difference mattered to her. She carried her file folder with the supporting documentation organized in the order she intended to present it, and had been up until 1 in the morning confirming everything was in place, not from anxiety but from the professional habit of someone who has learned early that preparation is the most reliable form of confidence. Clara did not attend. Wren had advised against it not for legal reasons but for practical ones. The records say everything that needs to be said, she told Clara the night before. You being there adds nothing to the argument. You'd spend 3 hours sitting in a hallway, and you have cedar siding to cut. She was right on both counts. Clara spent the morning on the cabin reconstruction, the cedar planking going up over the marine plywood sheathing. Each plank scribed to fit against the one below it, the work requiring the same patient repetition that all careful fitting work requires. The smell of the cedar was clean and specific, the resinous warmth of it filling the working space, the most pleasant smell Clara had been around in months. She heard the Civic coming down the dirt road before she saw it. Wren got out and stood for a moment beside the car with her hands in the pockets of her suit jacket and her file folder under her arm. She looked up at Clara on the scaffold. Permanent injunction, she said. Clara set down the scribing block. The court required Crane Atlantic to produce all original marina documents in support of their acquisition agreement, Wren said, coming toward the boat. When they produced them, Eleanor cross-referenced against her own records. Boyd Crane's group had submitted falsified lease lapse filings for 4 slips along this inlet, not just this 1-4. They were doing it systematically. She paused. The marina's owner in North Carolina was notified this morning. He terminated the purchase agreement with Crane Atlantic effective immediately. Clara looked at the houseboat, at the hull in its midnight navy, at the cedar going up plank by plank. What was he planning? She asked. Boyd Crane. What did he need the slips for? Commercial marina license, Wren said. He'd applied 3 months ago. To qualify, he needed contiguous ownership of at least 400 feet of active waterfront along this inlet. Frank's slip was the last piece. Without it, the application fails. He needed this specific slip to complete the contiguous footage. She looked at Clara. Frank's slip was worth more to Crane Atlantic than everything else they'd acquired combined. Without it, none of it worked. Clara thought about Frank Mead in March 2010, driving to the marina office and paying 10 years of slip fees in cash because he didn't want to worry about it anymore. Not knowing that his prepayment would a decade later be the specific document that dismantled a developer's scheme to take what Frank had spent 40 years building. Some things you do for reasons you do not know yet. Boyd Crane, Clara said, has no remaining legal basis to approach this dock, Wren said. His attorney sent a 1-paragraph letter this afternoon acknowledging the ruling. No appeal language. She looked at the boat, at what was becoming visible. I think he found out that Frank Mead had the kind of paper trail that doesn't forgive forgeries. Wren stayed for dinner Loretta's Thursday stew, which Clara had kept warm on the camp stove, plus cornbread from the paper bag Loretta had included that week. They ate on the dock as the evening came in over the marsh, the cordgrass going amber in the last light, the water taking on the flat pewter quality it had in the hour before dark. After Wren left, Clara sat on the deck for a while longer. The legal battle was over. The injunction was permanent. Boyd Crane was done. She had expected to feel more. The relief was real but small. The specific smallness of relief when the thing you are relieved about was never the center of what mattered. What mattered was the boat. What mattered was Frank's footlocker and Frank's letter and the photograph tucked behind the lining and her mother's handwriting in a notebook in a drawer. Boyd Crane had been the thing that required fighting. She had fought it through the right channels, and it had resolved. That was all. The center of what mattered had been here the whole time, and it continued to be here unchanged by the legal outcome. She went back to the cedar. There were still things she did not understand. The two empty bags had been sitting in the footlocker since she had counted the rows and found the gaps. She had placed them in their proper chronological positions between 1984 and 1986, between 1991 and 1993, and she had not closed the lid on them, letting them be visible, letting the gaps remain present rather than folding them away. Ray had said, "There's someone who should tell you about those years, when the time is right." She had trusted this. She was still trusting it. The explanation came on a Sunday morning in November, 3 weeks after the court ruling. Chester Vale came down the dock slowly. He was using his cane more than usual, not leaning on it dramatically, but placing it with each step in the way of a man who has decided to stop pretending he doesn't need it. He sat in the folding chair and looked at the boat for a while without speaking. The houseboat had changed substantially by November. The cedar siding was up on three sides, the natural honey color of the wood sealed against weather, but not yet painted the grain visible and warm. The new windows were fitted larger than the originals, framed properly, letting in light from both sides, so the cabin interior was bright in the morning and held the evening light as long as possible. The skylight was installed the glass-bedded in butyl in sealed position to throw a beam of morning sun directly onto the drop-leaf table she was going to build. Chester looked at it all carefully. Then he said, "I owe you something." "About the bags," Clara said. "About the bags," Chester said. "About the years that aren't there." He was quiet for a moment, not gathering his thoughts. The thoughts were gathered, deciding for the last time whether to say what he had already decided to say. Then he started talking. "Frank had one friend from Korea," Chester said. "One man who had been where Frank had been, who had done what Frank had done, who had come home carrying the same weight in the same way. His name was Birch Alderman, from Waycross, Georgia, which is about 40 miles from Jessup. Same unit. They were both at the Chosin Reservoir in November and December of 1950. He set his cane across his knees and held it there. "When you have been through a thing like that with a man," he said, "there is a connection that doesn't have a name in ordinary life. It's not friendship, though it is that too. It's something that was made under conditions that nothing in ordinary life can replicate, and it holds the way a structural weld holds, not decoratively, but actually load-bearing holding weight that would otherwise fail. You don't talk about it because talking about it would require talking about the conditions that made it, and the conditions are the part you don't talk about." Clara was sitting on the deck above Chester, her work set aside. "Birch Alderman died in February of 1985, Chester said. "Heart failure. He was 56 years old. He had a wife in Waycross, 3 children, grandchildren by the end. He and Frank hadn't seen each other often in their later years. Birch had his family and Frank had his boat, but they rote-called when they could. The connection held the way those connections hold." He looked at the inlet. "Frank found out by telegram," Chester said. "This was before any of the modern ways. A telegram. I drove out to the dock when I heard, and Frank was sitting on the deck with the telegram in his hand, and he looked at me and he said, 'Chester, he was the last one.' He meant the last man from his unit still alive. The last person in the world who had been where Frank had been, who knew without being told what that winter was like, what the cold was like, what it was like to do the things they had done, and then come home and have nobody who could follow you back there. Not because people were indifferent, but because there were no words that worked, and the experience was not something you could share across the gap between having been there and not." Chester paused. "When Birch died, the gap closed permanently. There was no one left on the other side of it. The dock was quiet, the marsh moved. Frank didn't come off this boat for close to 6 months after Birch died, Chester said. I brought food out twice a week and left it on the dock. He'd take the food. He wouldn't talk. He sat on the deck or inside and he looked at the water, and something was happening in there that I couldn't see and couldn't reach, and I learned to respect the boundary of it. He looked at his hands. I think what was happening was that he was deciding whether to stay, whether there was still a sufficient reason. He had come home from Korea at 22, and he had been deciding ever since, finding reasons, renewing the decision year after year. And this was one of the hard years, one of the years where the decision required the most from him. Clara thought about the 1985 bag, small, empty, the tag with the year and nothing inside. He found his way back, Chester said. He always did. By summer, he was coming off the boat again. By fall, he was working again. By the following year, he put a bag in the footlocker and wrote 1986 on the tag. He found his way back. A pause. 1992, Claire said. Chester nodded. He drew a breath. Frank had a dog, Chester said. A black lab mix. He'd had her since she was 8 weeks old. She came to him from a litter a man at the port had been giving away, and Frank took her on impulse, which was not like him, and then loved her the way people love things. They take on impulse and discover they needed more than they knew. He turned the cane once in his hands. He called her Sable, on account of the color. She was on this boat with him for 14 years, which is a long life for a dog. Long enough that she had grown into the boat, the way old dogs grow into old places, knowing every surface, sleeping in the same spots, moving through the space with the specific ease of something that belongs to it. He stopped, collected himself. When she went, Chester said, Frank came to find me. He walked up to my house. It's about a mile from the marina up the main road. And he sat in my kitchen and he drank a cup of coffee and he said, Chester, I don't know what I'm saving for anymore. Not to the room, not to the air. Directly to me, looking at me, in the voice of a man reporting a fact he is not sure how to survive. The cordgrass bent in the wind. The water moved. He said he had been saving for years for what exactly he wasn't sure. But there was something forward that the saving was pointed towards some future he could feel the shape of, even if he couldn't see the details. And when Sable died, he looked at the future and he couldn't find that shape anymore. He couldn't feel the thing he had been saving toward. He saved nothing that year. Chester looked at Clara. The following year, he put a bag in the footlocker and wrote 1993 on the tag. He found the shape again. He always found it again. But 1992 was the year he couldn't. Clara sat with what Chester had told her. 2 years and 40. 2 years when the thing Frank was carrying got heavy enough that the ordinary acts of continuation, the annual ritual of saving, of putting something aside, of making a deposit against a future he couldn't fully see, were more than he could do. Not more than he was capable of in the end. More than he could do in those specific years, in those specific circumstances. And then he had done it again. Both times. Found his way back, found the reason, found the shape of the future he couldn't see. 2 empty bags. Chester stood slowly using the cane. He looked at the footlocker which Clara had brought out onto the deck. I thought you deserved to know what the gaps were, he said. Frank wouldn't have wanted them hidden. He left the tags. He wrote the years on them and left them in the box with the others. He wanted whoever found them to know they were there. He just didn't want to have to explain them himself. He walked back up the dock with his cane, the movement measured and deliberate. Clara sat for a long time after he left. Then she picked up the 2 empty bags. She held them in her hands, their specific lightness, the canvas soft from years of being stored next to its neighbors, the tags with their faded years. 1985, 1992. She put them back in the footlocker. Not filled, not relabeled. Empty as they were in their proper places in the chronological sequence. Between 1984 and 1986, between 1991 and 1993. The gaps exactly where Frank had left them visible, present part of the record. Because the empty years deserved to be there. They were not failures. They were not things to be explained away or filled in or quietly removed from the account. They were the truest record in the entire Foot Locker, the years when the weight got heavy enough that the decision to continue was genuinely difficult, and the decision was made anyway. And the following year, Frank put another bag in the box and wrote another year on the tag. What do the empty years in a man's life tell us that the full ones cannot? They tell us that he was not made of stone. They tell us that the carrying had real weight and that carrying it was real work and that the work was not always easy. They tell us that choosing to continue year after year through the years when the choice was hard and the years when it was harder was itself the thing, not the accumulation, the continuation. She closed the Foot Locker and went back to the Cedar. The boat was finished on a Saturday morning in late January, 8 months to the week from the morning she had counted $10 into Ray Decker's hand. She had not planned for it to be finished on any particular day. The finishing had simply arrived, the last coat of sealant on the interior cedar dry, and cured the freshwater tank pressure tested, and confirmed the propane system inspected and certified by a technician from Brunswick who had checked every connection and every shutoff, and the CO detector mounted above the stove and signed off on all of it. The solar panel bank connected and charging the battery bank properly. The bilge pump tested, the navigation lights tested. She walked through the boat one final time before the relaunch. The interior was a different world from what she had found on the first night. The walls were cedar honey warm, sealed with a matte finish that brought out the grain without making the surface shiny. The skylight threw a beam of morning light that moved slowly across the cabin as the sun moved, warming first the table, and then the starboard wall, and then the foot of the bunk as the hours passed. The bookshelves she had built into every available wall space, floor to ceiling, on the forward bulkhead, flanking the windows on both sides, a row above the bunk specifically sized for the boat building manuals and tide charts and field guides, were already partly filled. The drop-leaf table folded against the forward wall when not in use. The built-in bench along the port side had storage below its seat, the lid fitted with bronze hinges. The bunk at the bow fit her dimensions exactly. She had measured herself in her sleeping bag and built accordingly, with drawers beneath for clothes and the small things that accumulate aboard. The galley had a properly vented 2-burner propane stove, a freshwater hand pump, a sink that drained overboard through a seacock. The composting head was behind a cedar frame curtain in the aft corner, functional and decent. The electrical system was marine grade throughout, color-coded, documented in a diagram she had drawn herself and laminated and fastened to the inside of the electrical panel door. And on the shelf above the bunk, the 1979 canvas bag, the first one Frank had filled in the year he bought this boat, beside the 1998 photograph of her parents at the Tennessee lake. Two things from the life she had come from, held together on a shelf in the boat she had built toward. Frank Mead's Foot Locker was under the bunk, the brass corners polished, the leather straps oiled, the contents arranged exactly as she had found them, with two exceptions: the 2 empty bags which she had placed back in their positions in the sequence visible and present and accounted for. Ray winched the boat down the timberways at 8 in the morning. The hull touched the water at the stern first, the steel settling into the inlet with the specific quality of a return. Not an entry, not an introduction, but a thing coming back to where it belonged. The hull sat exactly as it should, the midnight navy waterline precisely where the calculation had placed it. The cedar cabin above it, catching the winter morning light and returning it as warmth. Clara stood on the dock and watched it float. The boat looked from this angle nothing like what it had been and entirely like what it had always been. The bones were the same bones. The slip was the same slip. The inlet, the cord grass, the live oaks, the stand of Spanish moss behind the marina, all the same, unchanged. She had not altered the vessel's essential nature. She had not made it into something it wasn't. She had found what it was under the rust and the rot and the decades of deferred attention, and she had brought that back. She had not transformed it. She had restored it. There is a difference, and the difference matters. Transformation erases what was there before, replaces it with something new, makes the history irrelevant. Restoration honors what was there, finds the original intention, and brings it forward, makes the history present rather than absent. What she was standing beside was still Frank Mead's boat. Still the boat he had bought in 1979 for $400 and lived on for 40 years. Still the boat he had maintained and saved for and sealed a footlocker inside. It was also now Clara's boat. Both things at once. The history and the present occupying the same hull, which is what good restoration always achieves. Ray came and stood beside her. He looked at the boat for a long time. Not with professional assessment, though that was there too. The trained eye reading the work and finding it sound, but with something more. The way a man looks at something that has been done well and that he is glad exists in the world. In 35 years, Ray said, I have never seen a first-time hull job that good. He did not say anything else. He went back to the shop. Clara stood on the dock and let what he had said settle into her. And she thought about Earl Decker in the supply store in Carthage, explaining that a boat is a system, and a system can be fixed by someone who takes the time to understand it. She thought about the 3 years of parts catalogs and tide charts and late afternoons in the shop, learning what everything was called and why the names mattered. She thought about how all of it had been accumulating in her without her always understanding towards what the way saving accumulates, without always understanding toward what, until the accumulated thing is in front of you. And you can see looking back the shape of how it got there. Chester Vale came on the Sunday after the relaunch. He came down the dock slowly, with the cane doing more of the work than it had been doing a month ago, moving with the deliberateness of a man who is paying close attention to the signals his body is sending and has decided to take them seriously rather than argue with them. He stood at the end of the dock and looked at the houseboat for a long time. The light was the clear gray light of a Georgia winter morning, the sun not yet fully over the tree line, the water in the inlet pewter flat and reflective, the midnight navy hull doubled in the surface of the water below it. The cedar cabin above caught even the thin winter light and gave it back as warmth. The proportions were right. The boat sat right. It looked from every angle like something that had been waiting to look exactly like this and had finally gotten there. Chester did not say anything for a long time. When he finally moved, it was not to speak, but to nod a single deliberate, complete nod directed at the boat, at Frank's boat, at Clara's boat, at the thing that connected those two facts without contradiction. An acknowledgement of something larger than approval, an acknowledgement of something kept. Then he turned and walked back up the dock. At the end, he half turned without quite looking back. He'd be satisfied, Chester said. Frank, he would be satisfied. He walked to his truck and drove away, and the sound of the engine faded into the sounds of the marsh, and then the marsh absorbed even that. Clara went back aboard. She was doing the last interior work, the final fitting of the shelves on the forward bulkhead, scribing the edges to the wall so they sat flush, the kind of finish work that is invisible when it is done correctly and immediately visible when it is not. She was working at the back of the bottom shelf, reaching into the corner where the bulkhead met the interior surface of the hull, when her hand touched something it had not expected to touch. Not wood. She stopped. She reached back into the corner and felt for it. Something small and flat, wedged into the angle where the hull framing met the base of the bulkhead, wedged with intention, not fallen, not overlooked, placed there by someone who understood that this specific corner, in this specific angle, was a place that would not be disturbed unless someone was doing exactly what Clara was doing now. She worked it free. A tobacco tin. The flat rectangular kind, olive drab, the paint worn to bare metal in several places along the edges. A press-fit lid sealed with a thin bead of old marine sealant, applied years ago with care, with the understanding that the seal needed to hold. She could feel the waterproofing in the slight resistance the lid gave when she pressed on it. She sat down on the cabin floor. She pried the lid open carefully, working around the sealant with the flat of a screwdriver, patient with it, not forcing it. Inside, resting on a folded piece of canvas cloth, were 2 dog tags. Military-issue Korean War era. Stamped aluminum, the kind issued to United States Army soldiers at the beginning of the 1950s. The chain was intact, the ball chain, the kind with the small loop where a second tag could be attached. The metal was darkened with years but legible. She held them toward the light from the skylight above. Meade Frank ARA14, the serial number. The blood type O positive. The branch designation. The year of issue stamped into the lower corner 1950. He had been 20 years old when these were stamped. Standing in a processing line at a fort somewhere in the American South the summer of 1950, being sorted and numbered and issued identity in aluminum, before being sent to a place that would test every aspect of that identity in ways no processing line could prepare a person for. She turned them over. On the back of the second tag, not stamped, but scratched in, worked into the metal was something sharp and small, the letters shallow but clear, preserved by the tin in the sealant from the moisture that had touched everything else on this boat over the years, was a message. In case you ever wondered, I did make it home. It just took me a while to find where home was. FM Clara read it twice. She sat with the dog tags in her palm, in the skylight beam on the wall, in the cedar warm around her, in the water moving gently under the hull below her feet. And she thought about Frank Meade at 20 years old, standing in a processing line in the summer of 1950, with everything that was about to happen to him still ahead of him. Thought about the winter at Chosin Reservoir, which she had read about since Chester first mentioned it, the specific temperatures, the specific darkness, the specific requirement that the men in those mountains make decisions and perform actions that nothing in the world before or after would adequately prepare them for or adequately describe. Thought about coming home from that at 22 years old with the things that had no names. Thought about finding 27 years later a 30-foot steel-hulled boat on a Georgia inlet and understanding, standing on its deck, feeling the water under him, that this was the place, that this was where the things without names could be set down. I did make it home. It just took me a while to find where home was. She thought about what the word home actually means beyond the buildings and addresses and deed records and the places you are from. She thought about what it means when a place receives you when you step into it and something inside you stops bracing and starts resting. When the floor under you moves the way something alive moves, and the walls are close enough to be comforting rather than confining, and every surface is within reach, and the light through the windows is the specific quality of light you have been looking for without knowing you were looking for it. She thought about the first night on this boat, the rotted mattress pushed against the wall, the sleeping bag on the floor, the marsh alive outside with sounds she had never heard and would have been afraid of anywhere else, and the moment when the fear had stopped and something else had started, something that felt like being held. Some people find home early. Some find it in the place they were born, the house they grew up in, the landscape that shaped their childhood. Some find it in the person they choose, the life they build together, the shared accumulation of years. Others have to find it. They have to go looking for it sometimes without knowing they're looking, drawn by something they can't name toward a place they've never been but somehow know. And the finding, when it comes, has the quality of recognition rather than discovery. Not new exactly, not unexpected exactly, more like yes, more like here, more like this is the place I was looking for before I knew I was looking. Frank Meade had found it at 49. Clara May Holt had found it at 19. She stood up. She went to the shelf above the bunk, the 1979 canvas bag, the 1998 photograph of her parents at the Tennessee lake, her mother laughing, her father almost there. She held the dog tags for a moment in both hands, feeling their weight, the specific density of the aluminum, the ball chain cool against her fingers. Then she drove a small brass hook into the wall between the two things in the exact center of the space between them, and she hung the dog tags from it. 3 objects on a wall in a cabin on a boat in a Georgia inlet. A canvas bag from 1979, the year a man began building something without knowing exactly what he was building or for whom he was building it. A photograph from 1998, 2 people at a lake in Tennessee, both of them alive and not yet knowing what was coming, which was the same condition everyone was in always, which did not make it less or more of what it was. And 2 dog tags from 1950 hung on a brass hook between the other 2, with a message scratched on the back in letters that had been waiting in a tobacco tin in a corner for many years for someone to come find them. In case you ever wondered, I did make it home. Clara stood in the cabin of her boat and looked at the three things on the wall for a long time. Then she went to work. The months that followed made their own shape. She was working part-time at Ray's shop by February, 3 days a week, handling the smaller engine jobs that came in regularly through the winter months when boaters who had been ignoring problems since summer finally brought them in. Outboard carburetor rebuilds, fuel system diagnostics on older engines where the rubber had finally given up, electrical troubleshooting on installations that had been added to over the years by different hands using different wire gauges and different color conventions until the whole thing was a conversation between strangers that required someone patient enough to follow it from the beginning. She was good at the electrical work in particular. She had always been good at things that required seeing a system clearly tracing the logic of it, following the current back through the symptoms to the cause. Understanding why a fix that addressed the symptom without the cause was not a fix at all, but a delay. She had learned it at Earl's and reinforced it at Ray's, and it had become by this point not something she did, but something she was a person who saw systems, who read them, who understood how they were supposed to work, and what it meant when they didn't. Ray noticed. He did not say much about it, which was how he expressed most things he genuinely approved of. Not with words, but with the specific quality of his silence, which was different when he approved than when he was neutral, though most people could not read the difference. Customers began asking for her by name. Not immediately and not all at once. For the first weeks, it was the young woman Ray's got working for him. Then it was the young woman at Ray's place, she's good with the older outboards. Then it was Clara. Clara knows outboards. Clara diagnosed the wiring problem on Hank's center console when two other shops had told him the installation was too old to trace. Clara found the hairline crack in the fuel fitting on a Mako that had been causing intermittent engine loss for 2 seasons, a crack so small you couldn't see it unless you pressurized the system and knew what you were looking for. The marina community knew her by spring. Loretta Sims still came on Thursdays, still handed over the mason jar or the paper bag without ceremony, still said something brief and left. It was simply part of the week by now, a thread in the fabric of the days, unremarkable because it was reliable, and reliable things, when they are also good things, become the texture of a life rather than the events of it. Hank Pruitt still came on Saturday mornings to check the crab traps with her. The two of them moving along the dock edge in the early light, working quietly, talking about the water, the way people talk about the water when they live on it, not as a subject, but as a shared context, the way people who farm the same land talk about the weather. Chester Vale did not come back after that last Sunday in January. Ray told her in March that Chester's heart had been giving trouble through the winter, that he had moved in with his son in Waycross. Clara wrote him a letter, a real letter, handwritten on paper, sealed in an envelope, addressed and stamped because some messages need to be sent the way the people you are sending them to understand best. She told him about the dog tags. She told him what Frank had scratched on the back of the second one. She told him that she thought Frank had found where home was and that she was beginning to think she might be finding it too. She did not hear back. She hoped the letter arrived and hoped he read it, and she left the rest where it was in the care of slowness, which is the only pace at which some things resolve. It was on an evening in late April, a Tuesday warm enough to sit outside without a jacket, the marsh going copper in the low sun, that Clara understood something she had been moving toward for months without quite arriving at. She was on the deck of the houseboat. The sun was going down over the marsh in the particular way it goes down over open tidal water, not setting but dissolving, spreading itself across the horizon and into the cordgrass and the dark channels between the grass and the water surface, until the light was everywhere and nowhere, and then slowly not. A great blue heron was standing in the shallows about 30 feet off the port bow. She had seen this heron or a heron in the spot many times since she arrived. She had stopped trying to determine whether it was the same individual. It probably didn't matter. What mattered was that it was here, standing on one leg, in the shallow water, absolutely motionless, with the total committed patience of a creature that has made its peace with waiting, because waiting is the most productive form of effort available to it. She looked at the heron. The heron, after a moment, looked at her. They regarded each other across 30 feet of water in the low evening light, two solitary creatures that had found their way to the same inlet by routes that would be difficult to explain to anyone who hadn't traveled them, and who were not entirely sure what to make of the other, and who were not either of them inclined to leave. Clara thought about Grayfield, Mississippi, about a kitchen drawer with a folder of boat drawings that grew thicker every year, about a woman who had recognized something in those drawings before the girl making them understood what she was recognizing, who had written letters and kept notebooks and arranged things carefully in advance of a need she could see coming, even when the person the need belonged to could not. She thought about Eldon Holt in his corduroy recliner, a good man, a man who did his best in the specific, limited way that grief sometimes limits a person, and who had left in the most peaceful way the circumstances allowed. The green wool sweater was in the drawer under the bunk. She thought about Frank Mead, born in 1930, alive through Chosin, and the decades that followed, building up a record of his life, one canvas bag at a time, scratching a message onto the back of a dog tag and sealing it in a tobacco tin in the corner of a cabin wall, in case you ever wondered. She thought about her mother's handwriting on 3 lines in a notebook. Georgia coast, Brunswick Inlet, the water there. She thought about all of it, the whole long thread of it, the letters and the drawings and the notebook and the footlocker and the bags and the photograph and the dog tags. And she understood that what she was looking at was not a series of coincidences, not a series of lucky accidents that had aligned by chance. What she was looking at was something that had been arranged not by one person, not by any single deliberate act, but by the accumulated weight of several people paying attention and doing what they could with what they saw. Her mother, who had seen the drawings and understood what they meant, and quietly arranged what she could before she ran out of time to arrange anything else. Frank Mead, who had saved 1 bag per year for 40 years and left a letter addressed to whoever finds this because some part of him had refused to let the accumulation disappear without a destination. Earl Decker, who had kept a letter in his shirt pocket for 11 years and brought it out on a slow October afternoon because the time had come. Chester Vale, who had kept Frank's secret about the 2 missing years until the person who most needed to understand them was ready to hear. None of them had seen the whole picture. Each of them had seen their portion of it, had done what their portion required, and had trusted without knowing. They were trusting without any assurance that the trust would be honored, that the other portions would be handled by whoever was responsible for them. That's the thing about water. Water doesn't ask where you've been before it holds you. It doesn't require an explanation. It doesn't need to know your history or your name or what you couldn't finish or who you lost or how long it took you to get here. It simply receives you. It holds you with the same constant, patient rhythm. It applies to everything that floats on it without distinction, without judgment, without the small and large cruelties that land sometimes applies. It just holds you. And here is the thing that Clara May Holt understood on that Tuesday evening in late April, sitting on the deck of her boat with the marsh going dark around her and the herons still in the shallows and the dog tags inside on the wall and the water moving gently under the hull. The houseboat had been waiting for her for 40 years without knowing her name. Frank Mead had been saving for her 1 quiet canvas bag at a time, 1 year at a time, through the full years and the empty years and the years that required everything he had without knowing her face. And Margaret Holt had been pointing her daughter toward the water since before Clara could hold a crayon steady, since before Clara knew she was being pointed anywhere, since before the pointing itself was anything more than a mother watching a child draw boats and understanding in the specific way that some people understand the things they look at, that the drawing was not a hobby but a direction. 3 people who had never been in the same room. 1 boat, 1 inlet, 1 coffee can with $10 in it, and a girl who knew what marine epoxy was for. That's the thing about the directions our lives pull us in. We don't always know where we're going. We can't always explain to anyone, including ourselves, why we want what we want, or why we keep moving toward the thing we move toward when every practical consideration says to stop. But the pull is real, and it is old. And if you listen to it long enough, if you trust it the way Frank trusted the water, in the way Margaret trusted the drawings, in the way Clara trusted the bus ticket, and the $10 it will take you somewhere. Not always the somewhere you expected, not always the somewhere that makes immediate sense, but the somewhere that was always yours. Some people find it early. Some find it in the place they were born, the work they inherited, the life that was already there waiting for them. Others have to go looking. They have to follow a pull they can't explain toward a place they've never been guided by a map they didn't know they had until the night before they needed it, carrying a coffee can and a pair of broken zippered backpacks, and the kind of faith that is not religious but is real nonetheless. The faith that says the water is there and I know what to do when I get to it. Clara May Holt was 19 years old and homeless. She had $10 to her name, and she spent it on a rusted houseboat on a Georgia inlet on a forgotten dock at the end of a quiet backwater on a 30-foot steel hull that had been waiting in its slip with quiet, patient faith for exactly the person who would know what to do with it. It was the best $10 she ever spent. If this story moved you, we'd be grateful if you'd subscribe to the channel and share it with someone who needs to hear it today. And tell us in the comments, what's a place you've been moving toward your whole life, even before you knew you were moving? What's the pull you've been following, even when you couldn't explain it? We read every comment, every one of them. We'll see you in the next story.